Okay, we can go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to our webinar, Financing the Future, Unlocking Clean Energy Investments. My name is Andy Barnes. I serve as Director of Policy and Communications at the Clean Energy Business Network. I'm also joined by my CEBN colleagues, Eric Foster and Lynn Abramson. Really appreciate you all joining us today. We have a fantastic panel lined up. But before we jump into the discussion, two quick housekeeping items. This event is being recorded. We will be disseminating the recording and the slides to all registrants afterwards. In addition, we will have time at the end of the panel discussion for Q&A. So please do submit your questions into the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. For those that aren't familiar with our organization, wanted to provide a quick background on the Clean Energy Business Network. So the CEBN is a nationwide nonprofit organization that serves as the small business voice for the clean energy economy. We democratize access to the clean energy economy by supporting small businesses and community-based organizations through policy engagement, market and technology education, and business development assistance. Our network spans more than 8,000 small business and community leaders in all 50 states across the US that are working in a broad array of clean energy technologies and services. So our network is very diverse technologically and geographically. A little bit about our programming through both our small business and community engagement. We are focused on expanding access to the clean energy economy. So we engage with the federal government both on the policy front by informing program design and the stakeholder outreach front by promoting government resources. We have many free resources you can access on our website. I just wanted to highlight a few. Our clean tech funding database serves as a clearinghouse of funding opportunities. So this is a searchable aggregation of federal, state, and private sector resources for energy innovators and community organizations. In addition to that, we have several blogs and email digests that work to distill government programs, including two series unpacking recent grant programs and tax incentives coming out of the Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure law. So feel free to take anything you find useful from our resources and adapt or amplify it for your respective audiences as you see fit. In addition to that, I wanted to flag one timely resource. If we could go to the next slide. One timely resource is our recent blog post on the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. You may have read about the GGRF in the news recently, and you will hear more about it in the panel discussion today. But this blog post from our colleague Awa Darbo highlights the program objectives, including the various subsets of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, the National Clean Investment Fund, Clean Communities Investment Accelerator, and the Solar for All programs. So with that, I'm pleased to hand things over to my colleague, Eric Foster, who serves as CEBN's Senior Advisor for Equitable Economic Opportunity, who will be moderating our panel discussion today. So over to you, Eric.
Well, thank you, Andy, and good afternoon or morning, depending upon where you are joining us from today. My name is Eric Foster, and I am a part of the CEBN team, as Andy mentioned, Senior Advisor for Equitable Economic Opportunity. And we have a great panel today. We're looking forward to a great discussion, and we want it to be lively with you all to participate and ask questions, because this is for you to get a lot of information. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to introduce each one of our panelists and ask them to come join me on the stage. First, we have John Payne, who's the Chief Financial Officer for Dream.org. We have William Barber, who is the Director of Equitable Investment and Energy Justice for the Coalition for Green Capital. We have Urvi Nagrani, who is the Director of Business Development for Climate Finance Solutions. And we have Helen Bertelli, who's the founder and executive director for Women Plus in Climate Tech. So I want to thank you all for joining us. We are excited and happy to have you here and have you all to be able to discuss and share a lot with us and with our audience participants. So with everybody up, if you all can individually tell me a little, or tell our audience a little bit about your organization and how your work fits into the clean energy financing space.
Well, I'll go first. Hi, everyone. My name is John Payne. I'm the Chief Financial Officer for Dream.org. Dream.org is a national 501c3 with the mission to close prison doors and open doors of opportunity into the green economy. Specifically, Dream.org's Green for All program works to ensure that historic climate funding benefits communities that need it the most. We believe those closest to the problem are closest to the solution. Therefore, by uplifting disadvantaged communities and creating green career pathways for unrepresented talent, we can build an inclusive green economy that creates environmental and economic benefits for everyone.
Well, thank you, John. I appreciate that. Who wants to go next? Please jump in. The water is nice,
All
warm.
right. I'll hop in. So I'm Urvi Nagrani. I'm with Climate Finance Solutions, and we are a mission-based firm that helps companies secure non-dilutive funding in the form of grants and other public dollars, as well as through philanthropic programs. And our goal is really, how do we take all of the money that's earmarked for capital and get it into really impactful projects? In the last 3 years, we've helped companies win $1.45 billion, including in some of those GGRF funds that were mentioned. And so we work with companies and organizations across the stage, everything from startups to tribes. And our goal is very simple. How do we make sure that we are having an equitable climate impact where the best technology and teams that can actually have scalable solutions for the community are able to get the resources they need to do their good work?
All right. Well, thank you. And what you said about non-diluted is important because I used to have a pool with my second ex-wife and our sons, and when the pool got diluted, it wasn't a good look. So you don't really want to mess with diluted stuff. So thank you for bringing that qualification of non-diluted, means clean and free funding. So Helen, William, who wants to jump in next?
Sure. Thanks, Eric. We'll jump in here. So my name is William J. Barber III. I'm the Senior Director of Impact Equitable Investments at the Coalition for Green Capital. Coalition for Green Capital is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to accelerate the deployment of clean energy technology to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases and other air pollutants and to address climate and energy-related environmental injustice. We do this by creating and implementing green bank financial institutions across the country that use public funds and proven financing methods to mobilize additional private investment in renewable energy and energy efficiency, as well as decarbonization technologies. CGC also manages the American Green Bank Consortium, which consists of over 40 green banks and other financing entities focused on advancing clean energy across the country. And since 2011, we actually have driven that ecosystem more than $15 billion in combined public and private investment into clean energy technologies. More recently, we were announced through EPA selection of its Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund awardees for an award of $5 billion from the National Clean Investment Fund, which we hope to continue to scale up our investing operations, as well as engaging in low-income disadvantaged communities across the country.
Well, that's great news. And that consortium of stakeholders and financiers, it's important, everybody, to be able to connect to organizations that have a multitude of resources and partners. So Helen, let's bring you up, not least, but definitely the last one of our panelists to introduce themselves.
Thank you. My name's Helen. Since 2018, I've been scaling climate tech companies of all different stripes. I formed my own marketing agency at that point in time and plugged into several climate tech startups, including the climate service that was sold to S&P Global for close to $75 million, and Global Weather Corporation. Both entities took publicly funded data and utilized them in a way that ended up making a small number of people a heck of a lot of money. I was not one of them. I did not have equity because I was an agency owner. And so I started to see some disturbing trends along my journey and formed Women in Climate Tech. It's now close to 5,000 subscribers globally. So a lot of people feel the same way, that people are being left out, small businesses specifically are being left out of the energy transition. And so I've devoted most of my work to trying to find a way to embed equity in climate finance. We ran a program a few years ago called the TECFD, literally trying to embed equity in the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's a framework that embedded climate risk into finance. We did what we could, but getting funding and support for such a thing at the time was not easy. I'm very hopeful that some of the work that we've been doing now, considering Justice 40 and some of the renewed interest in equity, will help bring to fruition some of the work we've done. And in fact, I'm here at the Center for Energy Education, run by Mosine Lowe today. And I'm working with these guys on the ground programs for Enfield and some of the towns in abjectly poor areas here in North Carolina that desperately need attention.
Well, thank you, Helen. And I like what you said about intentionality, because as my grandma Foster used to always say, closed mouth doesn't get fed. She used to tell that to the grandkids and to my dog Rex, because if he was hungry, he needed to open up his mouth too. So you have to be intentional. That is critical. So I'm going to ask a few questions just to get us started. And please, I might ask a lead person, but I want others to chime in as well, because we want a flowing, engaged conversation. So, Urvi, can you share some elements or tips for successful grant writing in the clean energy sector? And what are some key things or elements that funders are looking for in those grant applications when they get it on the desk?
Yeah, so great question. The key thing that I would think is you really need to do your homework beforehand. So a lot of folks, they see the headlines and they go, there's so much money, and then they think it's going to be easy, and they kind of take it for granted as this is an endeavor worthy of your time, your focus, and putting in some legwork to make sure that you are doing it correctly. Now, when I say doing it correctly, I mean you need to vet a grant and the non-dilutive funding the same way that you would vet a VC investment when they were asking for a board seat. You've got to consider, is this aligned with where you want to be in the next year, the next 3 years, the next 5 years? Are the project requirements that are going to come with this going to take key personnel in a way that's going to enhance your ability to make it to market? Or is this actually going to be a distraction that will slow your growth? Just like there are wonderful investors out there, there are also terrible investors out there. And sometimes the same pool of money can be wonderful for one organization and terrible for another. It really depends on what is your roadmap. So one of the things we tell our clients all the time is don't drive off your roadmap to chase funding, because fundamentally that will slow you down. When you've decided what is the correct source of funding, so is it the right technical readiness level for your product, or is it the right deployment methodology for the solutions you are trying to bring to the market? Make sure those are aligned. Then look at who are the partners that you need to be working with. Are these reliable, trustworthy, dependable folks who are going to be able to stay on time and budget? Because those requirements are going to matter. And if you can do one grant on time and on budget, that is going to help you apply for the next one. And so you've got to consider it not just from what is a single award going to do for me, but how is this going to create a halo effect that's going to attract others to your organization, to your mission, to help you scale, and to position yourself for future growth. Because when we're thinking about sort of the climate crisis, we really have to be aware of the fact that no one project is going to solve the climate crisis. It's going to be one project on your journey of growth that will help you get to the next, which will help you get to the next, and achieve those elements of scale that will get to gigaton impacts. But to get there, you really need to be focused on what is our long-term vision and how does this step work to get us there. Because if you're going after the right funding with the right partners and the right grants and you're doing your due diligence, then it is much easier to do the actual, nuts and bolts of a 200-page application, because then you're just explaining what's already in place. Whereas if you're thinking about it as if it were free money, you're going to come in and go, oh my God, there's so much paperwork. But people tend not to say that when they're going, to a real estate fund to get, financing for a solar project. They go, that's the normal amount of due diligence. You've just got to think about a grant application as this is the due diligence to achieve funding. And the key thing there is that it is non-dilutive funding. So unlike if you were going to get a large private investment where you might have to surrender a board seat or some of the ownership, a grant fund, you get to retain control and ownership. That is hugely valuable. You might have strings attached to a single project, but you ultimately keep the organization's ownership intact. And so that's kind of one of those trade-offs where when you're thinking about your full climate stack of funding, there are times and places where grant funding works really well, and there's times where private capital works really well. And so figuring out that balance and where and how to deploy the capital can make you have a much more successful journey because your organization is in alignment with the requirements.
No, thank you. That is great. So to kind of summarize in a sense, don't go chasing waterfalls, stick to the rivers and lakes you used to. If you're not comfortable with work, the last day we didn't have to work was the day before we were born. So just get used to it. We've all had to work ever since that day. We're going to have to keep working. And ultimately, make sure that you can trust the people that you're working with and they align with your vision. Because just like the great scholars, the Spinners had the song, The Backstabbers, you don't need funders that are going to possibly short circuit or backstab your vision.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that like it's kind of backstabbing. It's more just different funders have different agendas. And so like if you are taking funding from a research institute, they're going to want to have you publish. Do you have a trade secret that you don't want to publish? That's probably not the right funding for you. Whereas if the goal is just, we want you to scale up and create jobs, that might be in alignment with you. There's sometimes when you do want to publish information, and having that sort of third-party verification is really valuable. That kind of a strategic alignment of just make sure your goals are all on the same page, because otherwise, if it's asking you to do something that is just outside of your wheelhouse, just say no, you don't need to do it. It's much easier to say no to the wrong funding than it is to be contractually obligated to work with a bunch of people that your org isn't ready to.
No, and that's great. I mean, and that's right. I only use that analogy because that was the best one I had in the toolkit, but I'll work on better ones as we go forward.
The don't
So,
go tracing waterfalls was brilliant, though.
well, you set it up. All I did was just come in and knock it down, but you set it up. And so, want to bring everybody else into this. So, John, and if you could kind of come in terms of what your thoughts are on strategies or tools that you use to identify potential sources of funding and keep track of the opportunities, because the field is diverse. It's like the NFL draft, thousands of possible players, but who are going to be those 10 or 12 that are going to get you from a 1-15, well, 1-16 season, now they win 17 games, to a Super Bowl?
Yeah, thanks for that. I will add this to what was already said. Many awarded grants identify a couple of things. One was wanting to support the community benefits, job creation, as well as economic development stemming from the investments. And so they will specifically look for investment opportunities, which are elements of their proposal. Now, if this is new for your company or your organization, I will encourage you to look into the resources that we have at dream.org that provides, that we provide, and that some of the best practices for proving benefits to low income and disadvantaged communities. Keep in mind that a lot of the funds that are available in GGRF is directly centered in community-based proposals, and it goes into low income and disadvantaged communities. So you have to make sure that you have a strong connection with these communities in order to build your trust with those communities so you can move projects forward.
Okay.
On that
Let me,
point, can I just
oh,
like
go
say
ahead.
one more thing? The
Yes,
other thing that's really important, if you historically have been, aware of programs where they say you need to be in these communities, a lot of those programs were very exploitative. They would have a developer go into a community, they would do work on top of the community and not with the community. That is something that has been very clearly called out. And so a lot of the most recent climate funding, it doesn't just include location-based requirements like some of those development zones historically used to. It includes who are the partnerships? What are the community benefits agreement? How are you doing the work? And so there's a lot more nuance to community engagement. And also, if you're doing both state and national funds, check your definitions. The definition of a disadvantaged community, according to a Justice 40 requirement, is different than, for example, a California CalEnviro or, for example, New York has their own version of what a disadvantaged community means. So if you want to stack state and federal grants, check the definitions and make sure your project hits those requirements, and do not use legacy information from projects that are more than 5 years old, because that justice and equity component was nowhere near as strong. And so if you take old advice, you will be not meeting the mark.
so don't put old wine in new wineskin. And let me ask a question to both of you all, and then, William and Helen, please chime in. That dynamic of community. So how do we take, say, if the organization or the group, and I use the thought of, if we took Plato and Socrates from their time and placed them in now, how would we make or help them make the translation to be able to connect with scholars like William's father, Bishop Barber, who's a great scholar, theologian, and leader in the Civil Rights Initiative, but also a very learned person. So, how would we make that transition between the learneds of today and the Platos and Socrates, juxtaposing the organizations and that community dynamic? Because not everybody knows how to be bilingual in speaking different communities.
So I'd say that's definitely a great question for starters. That's where partnerships come in. If you want to go far, you're going to want to go with people who know the space, and you want to have an open mind in learning. Like, there's a reality that if you're a solar developer and you are an expert in electronics, you might not know the nuances of tribal sovereignty. But if you want to do a solar program for tribes, it doesn't make sense for you to talk down or over those tribes. You need to come in being willing to be a partner. And so that means the ownership isn't just yours as an organization. The ownership goes to the community. There are going to be multiple stakeholders. And so you really have to approach it in a multilateral way, as opposed to a top down. So that's kind of the key thing, is if you approach it where every stakeholder has agency and voice, you're much more likely to have a scenario where, instead of you saying, all right, I'm Socrates and I need to teach Plato, it's much more, we're having a Socratic seminar and everyone's voice matters.
Okay, good, good. Helen, you deal with that, helping the communities that are not represented, those that truly have been left behind or left out, if you will, make that representation. So, what would you say to that particular question of bridging that gap, being able to speak the language of the multitude of stakeholders in that community? Because communities are not homogenous. They have different stakeholders with different needs that still may have alignment. How would you, what would you say to this?
First, I'd like to actually agree with your comment about backstabbers. I could tell you so many stories over whiskey. Having scaling climate tech startups since 2018, I've been involved with seeing a lot of investments, a lot of venture capitalists, a lot of private equity and whatnot. And I can tell you there's shenanigans up the wazoo. People in the know with finance have the power, and the money is going to them.
Okay.
Communities that don't have the infrastructure in Enfield, I mean, I'm sure some of you guys know this, 40% of the community lives in condemned housing. We're talking about disparities that are unbelievable.
Right.
And frankly, leading to disquiet. And people are frustrated. Small business owners are frustrated. I believe a lot of the messaging coming out of the DOE has focused on large infrastructure and then jobs, right? But the majority of businesses in the United States, 99.9% are small businesses. Most people in the US affiliate themselves with either being a small business owner or an employee of a small business. So we have to do more very quickly to get small businesses the benefits. And from what I'm seeing on the ground, it's just not happening fast enough. So I think we need to think about things differently. If we're facing, frankly, annihilation, right? We're talking about the climate crisis. And from years ago when I founded Women in Climate Tech, I felt how preposterous is it that we think we're going to solve this crisis with the same market mechanisms that got us here and the same people. It's a big problem. So I do think that grant funding is a wonderful way to get dollars to small business. I applaud the efforts. They are, venture capitalists and others, just for example, only 6% of dollars go to women-owned businesses in venture capital. And I can tell you some stories on the ground from women-owned climate tech startups. They are treated much worse than a lot of male-owned. I've seen some terrible things happening. And so we know when power is concentrated in one type of person that is problematic, and we're seeing that happen again. And we have to work hard to change the conversation so we can level the playing field.
So we need to learn small business as a language. And because small business is going to be the primary driver, I want to dovetail that to you, William, because you all at Coalition for Green Capital, with your selection for the EPA's Clean Investment Fund, as well as the Solar for All program, to help get dollars, billions of dollars into communities for these projects. How are you all looking at getting those small businesses? How are you looking at speaking small business language to get them and organizations that could be allies to them in the game so they can participate and tap into some of this funding?
It's a great question, Eric, and it's a really exciting conversation. I would first say about project and partnerships. So, of course, our work builds on financing and funding partnerships with foundations, with impact investors, lenders, institutional investors, development banks, climate funds, and others who are seeking to deploy their capital into clean energy and climate-related projects to earn attractive returns while making an impact. The flip side of that coin, of course, is to have the projects identified in and of low-income disadvantaged communities that are actually benefiting the communities and that actually represent priorities that communities have been sharing in some cases for decades. We have a chance now to bridge the capital with the designated intent to have real impact, create a true, just, equitable transition on the ground. So that is one place. In our application to EPA, we also stressed the urgency, the need for speed, if you will. And that's another place to partner. In our application, we stress that investments in products in technologies and services that reduce greenhouse gas emissions that are made earlier have a much larger reduction impact than similar investments made later. We actually did modeling that shows that dispersing $2 billion per year over 5 years compared to dispersing $10 billion in 1 year results in about 30% less GHG reduction by 2030. So to maximize impact, we have to make sure that we're deploying dollars as quickly as possible. And as a way to collaborate with the communities, with the small businesses, that means we have to be identifying those projects as quickly as possible. We're talking about servicing in this moment over 27,000 low-income disadvantaged communities across the nation if you go off data of the Climate and Environmental Justice Screening Tool. So we're talking about a massive ramp up and a massive opportunity for collaboration in the financial sector, but also with local CBOs. Now, I do want to flag, of course, the objectives from EPA that those projects and that project deployment is subject to. So number one, primarily reducing emissions of greenhouse gases and other air pollutants. That's a big factor we have to think about when we are prioritizing projects. Number two, making sure that we're delivering the benefits of GHG and air pollution reducing projects and technologies to American communities, especially low-income disadvantaged communities that have been too long left out of the equation. And then number three, mobilizing financing and private capital investment to stimulate additional deployment of qualified projects so that we reach our climate goals, that much more quickly. And I would just end by saying CGC has really worked heavily to establish a robust community engagement plan, creating those inlets of conversation with small businesses, with community-based organizations. We maintain now a working group of over 6 CBO partners across the nation who specialize in everything from workforce development to community engagement strategies, financial literacy training, to pre-development activities, helping communities increase their ability to originate project concepts in of themselves, not just being subject to projects that are kind of coming from an external source. So we've done that. We've also implemented our framework, our 357 framework, which was developed with that working group, as well as our Environmental Justice Advisory Board, that represents a set of key performance indicators focusing on concepts of energy, environmental, and climate justice, and making sure that all projects at least hit some combination of those indicators that communities are identifying. So it's a massive opportunity. It's a massive opportunity for collaboration, and it's a massive opportunity to do some good for the planet.
So I want to open this next part up to John and William, but Helen and Urvi, please jump in. You all have used a lot of terms: decarbonization, greenhouse gas reduction, green banks. These are, to a lot of people, a lot of small businesses, a lot of possible partners and collaboratives, you're speaking French to people in Portugal. How do you make this connect in layman's terms? It's like when I talk to little kids and they sometimes look at me like, you're using all these big words. Can you bring it down to a level I might be able to pick up? And then also with green banks, as a part two to this, can you give a little background on what green banks are? Because when I first heard of green banks, I actually thought, okay, these must be banks that they're going to make out of plant material, or they're going to paint them green or something of that sort. What is a green bank? So if you can also talk about that and how that creates an opportunity to really support the development. So it's a twofer: demystifying the language, and then what are the opportunities with green banks and what are green banks?
Well, let me jump in on the first part, and I'll let the green bank conversation, I'll let William handle that, if he will. First of all, let me clarify something real quickly. The GGRF funds are not grants. they're loans. And so now you're talking about bringing loans into LIDAC areas, low income disadvantaged communities. So automatically there's going to be distrust from these communities in dealing with the federal government, and rightly so. There's a lot of reasons for there to be distrust. So in order to bring that distrust level down, you have to have engagement with these communities. You have to build trust inside of these communities. One way in which to do that is to engage Black and brown business owners to do the work inside of these communities. So once you engage these communities, you bring in folks who look like people who live in the community to help communicate with the objectives and what the goals are. So now we're talking about a lot of challenges that are actually facing these communities. And, you know, many Black and brown businesses do not have the social or economic capital needed to grow and meet this moment. So investors in climate often overlook these innovators and have yet to have any incentives that will work in these low income and disadvantaged communities. Now, with the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, investors will be incentivized to work in these communities historically left out of the green transition. So businesses that know how to work with those communities will have a competitive advantage. And this is where the trust is going to be. So especially if they have meaningful relationships in these communities on the ground, they can build these trusts, and we can have that conversation that brings in common ground language and common language to the community to build the trust so we can get the projects going. And if William, CGC has a bunch to do with Green Bank, so I'll turn that part over to you so you can explain it to the audience.
Yeah, no, thank you, John, for the handoff. I will also, kind of say, how do we demystify, the language is, I think, starting with the talking points that communities and small business owners care about. You got to start there before you kind of interpose some of these other considerations. And I often frame this colloquially as DEIJ, but not in the expected form. That when we're talking about projects, we're talking about dollars for communities, we're talking about lowering emissions, we're talking about the impact these projects will have on individuals that we care about in these communities, our family, our neighbors, the people who work in these communities. And then we're talking about jobs and economic opportunity. How do clean energy projects catalyze and touch on each of those touch points, which are we found many times priorities for communities on the ground. Now, to demystify the concept of green banks, so they aren't the institutions, Eric, as you alluded to, that are constructed out of biomaterial, but they are rather mission-driven financial institutions that use financing to accelerate our transition to clean energy solutions and fight climate change. By being mission-driven, it means that green banks care about deploying clean energy projects. That is a primary kind of charge for every green bank. In doing that, green banks work to actively develop pipeline of clean projects and seek out opportunities to attract financing for those projects to get them that more likely to be deployed. This is especially important when we talk about deploying projects in communities that have traditionally struggled to attract financing. I'm talking, red line communities, economically disinvested communities, communities that have been unbanked and unfinanced. So green banks really feel a critical gap in being able to drive capital, but also help with project deployment. The fact that these organizations are established as institutions mean that green banks are durable and can build up organizational culture and expertise. They have autonomy to be flexible and responsive to the on-the-ground needs of the communities in themselves. And in contrast to programs, these institutions, they can try something, learn, try something, and keep that process as they are seeking to meet the needs of communities that they serve. And then finally, I said at the top, all green banks have the mission to address climate change. All green banks have the mission to address climate change, though many also have additional objectives to serve in improving resiliency or serving low-income disadvantaged communities. So that's an added bonus. So think again of these green bank institutions as vehicles to connect the financing with the intent to make our communities greener, more resilient, and to scale our solutions to the climate crisis.
You know, one thing I want to add on that is also that this money is not for new innovative climate technology. It is for current commercial technology and have it spread into these low income and disadvantaged communities. And again, it is a loan. So you have to make sure that the project that you are entering into has a mechanism to give you a return so you can actually pay back the loan. One way that we actually give technical assistance to our communities is that we say, you know, look at the, community change grants and other grants that are out there to help give you a baseline so you can start prepping for shovel-ready projects that you can use GGRF funding to. That same application that you use for those grants will also can be transferred over to GGRF funding as well. But again, you have to make sure that you're dealing with the loan, which is hard to do in these communities as well, because a lot of them just aren't versed in being able to do a loan. But it's just like when you get a loan for a car, you get a loan for a mortgage. But what's really different is that when you pay this loan back, that project has to be able to generate that revenue in order to pay that loan back. Then the green banks will take this money back, and now you're talking about perpetuity, because they can then reissue that fund, and it can go on and on and on. And you can see how the cycle can be created to just totally transform the communities that we're speaking of.
Okay.
Yeah, I think one other thing is, like, when you're talking about educating on these issues, it really helps to know where the person is coming from, both geographically, what their educational background is, what their expertise is. So, for example, if you are a scientist who's just developed an innovative product, you might not know any of the financial side, but you know a great deal about the emission side. So we don't necessarily need to teach you that. Whereas if you're a community activist, you might know, hey, all my neighbors are getting cancer. I don't know exactly which chemical is causing it, but I know we need some environmental cleanup. That's a very different conversation. Even some of the acronyms we use have multiple meanings in different contexts. So if you were to look at a project and say the, abbreviation PTO, a lot of people think, okay, paid time off. I know what that one is. You ask a utility person, that's power turn on. That's when the site starts. You ask a vehicle person, that's power take off. That's an engine system that reduces your emissions. Sometimes when you're starting to think about these projects that are going to be more systems level and have more stakeholders, a lot of it is dialing it down. Instead of saying an abbreviation, define what you're talking about. Make sure we're all on the same page. Even common abbreviations for the clean tech space, GGRF, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, right now is a federal program that's talking about loans. Historically, GGRF was the cap and trade revenue from the combination of California and several Canadian provinces. Even if you're talking about, climate, it's really important to step back and say, what is the lens that I am wearing? What is the lens that the person I'm talking to is wearing? And what are their specific needs? As Helen talked about the fact, small businesses have radically different needs than larger businesses. Larger businesses are often, much more able to get some of those scale challenges where you can bring down those costs. And a lot of, for example, climate tech companies, their goal is, I want to sell to the large business at a premium price, use that to develop my, manufacturing processes, scale the company. And then as those prices come down, now I'm going to do small and medium-sized businesses. Now, that's a very different approach than when, for example, you're taking a commercial product like solar and you're just trying to let's get as many local installers involved. Then we don't necessarily need to bring that tech to a more approachable place. It's already there. And now it's a question of how do we get local roofers who know the building codes in this town and how it's different from one county over. So it's really important when you're thinking about both grants and other financing mechanisms to look at who's there, what's the state of the technology, what's the state of the market that they're deploying into, and what is the realistic speed with which it can be deployed. Because some programs are, first come, first serve. You apply now, you'll get money in 3 months. Others are you're applying for a year and a half down the line. And this is a really lengthy process that will be a multi-year endeavor. Being very aware of what you're stepping into is sort of the first step to success.
Okay. No, thank you all for that important feedback. Helen. because your organization focuses on helping women, empowering them and amplifying them in this industry, what can we do collectively to better support women founders and entrepreneurs of all ethnicities in this sector overcome those barriers that are roadblocks and potholes to being able to get those opportunities?
Thanks for asking the question. I don't know what the answer is because I've been at this for many years and have yet to see a dime on the women in climate tech side. It is virtually impossible to raise funds for women-specific stuff within climate tech. And you talk to any organization similar to mine, and they'll say the same thing. People talk a big talk, but the money does not follow. That's unfortunately. So I'm going to speak generally to small business because when I ran the webinar with few people who are on this may have been on that in January, investigating how women can benefit from IRA funding. This was in January. The topic of community benefit plans came up. Now, every project and every developer getting grants or loans from the federal government is required to create a community benefit plan and show how a portion of those benefits are going to go back to communities. Now, that's, as far as I can tell, one of the best vehicles for getting money directly to communities. The problem is the process is opaque. These community benefit plans right now are being written by large law firms, and I know this is a fact. Last year, I was working in a material science company that employed Cooley Goddard to do their community benefit plan, which is one of the largest law firms in the world. So the money, these entities, these consultants are creating community benefit plans for communities, maybe dialoguing with the communities if they're lucky. But for the most part, if they do, they disappear. And then the communities are left frustrated. What we've done is develop a database. We're calling it Main Street Wealth Connector, which is inspired by the Norwegian Wealth Fund, which shared wealth back from the oil and gas discoveries about a decade ago. It was very successful. And number one, we're identifying all the women-owned and small and minority-owned businesses in disadvantaged communities so that developers can find them. They can no longer say, well, we don't know, right? And number two, we're providing training so that these communities can do their own community benefit plans and get paid for it. So what people need is money right now. You walk into Enfield and say, oh, we want to give solar, and they've got holes in their roofs. They can't wait for 3 years and tax incentives and loans for, it's low on their list of things. Now, eventually we want this because the energy burden would be hugely reduced for them. But people are living hand to mouth, and business owners are struggling all over the country. So they need to be paid to do their own community benefit plans, and we need a mechanism to do that right away. And that levels the playing field. Finally, I'll also say, we're just nibbling around the edges unless we do systemic change. So I'm here at the center today, and there's this wonderful speaker from the Ella Baker Educational Project. She was a civil rights activist, and she was a huge proponent of co-ops. Yeah. That's ownership by employees, right? So as businesses are built and funded, and I honestly think these green banks and others should require businesses to be located in the areas and to be co-ops owned by people in the community, different ownership structures that perhaps most Americans are familiar with, the less extractive. We need change. We need IP to be shared back into the communities. I told you about those businesses, those climate tech businesses that take data from federally funded government projects and sell it, and the venture capitalists make money. That's corporate socialism. We need to share IP rights back into communities. And you're talking about how to make these projects work financially for communities. Well, guess what? If they own a bit of the IP, conversation changes. That's how these guys are making money, IP. Why aren't we talking about changing the parameters of the discussion so that communities have power again? Right now, the power dynamic is too off balance. And come November, guess what? Community benefit plans, these conversations are going to be shut down if things change. If it's not November, it's 4 years from now. So we need to push for structural change to keep these power structures more level so we don't lose ground in a few months or down the line.
You know, Eric, let me say this about the community benefit plans. Dream.org sat on the commission of the EPA and Department of Energy to help really define the Justice 40 initiative in these plans. And rightfully so, after that, we have provided technical assistance to community-based organizations to help develop these community plans. So Helen is absolutely right. You know, before it used to be corporate folks that would come in and say, this is what we're going to do in your community without having any information from the community for what they need. Because what's needed in North Dakota is not needed in Tallahassee, Florida, right? So the community is best to describe what they actually need in their community. And so we work with community-based organizations. We provide technical assistance to help them create their community benefit plan, which also has to include workforce development. And I will say that I agree with something that Helen said, but with a little twist, is that the workforce development plan really has to include the adults or the young adults that are in these communities to help maintain these systems. So now if you look at with the creation of AI, you see jobs that were tailored for these communities are now going away. You don't need them. So now what comes up? So now you're having that big divide grow even bigger. Now what you can give them is green jobs. You can give them green pathways. And who's more likely to hire people in these communities are the entrepreneurs who represent and look like these people in the communities. So now we're talking in a lot of cases, second chance hiring, people who were formerly incarcerated. How do they now fit into this economy? We at Dream.org, we work with communities to make sure that it is community-based, organization-driven, and that in that community plan, we are tailoring the workforce development for the people in and of that community.
You know, this is a good
There's also,
first.
you know, one more complication, which is when we're thinking about climate, there's multiple aspects. There's how do we cut emissions? There's how do we adapt our existing systems so that they are more resilient? And then there's how do we address ongoing catastrophes? So the answers for each of those buckets are going to look really different. And so sometimes, you know, there's a program where, you know, we want to do adaptation. And so that's going to look like building retrofits, new jobs, and there's going to be a heavy labor component. Other times it's going to be when it is unsafe to work in the fields because of fire in the air and just like mega wildfires, having things like remote control operated tractors that can go out and, you know, do some work without a person being in harm's way. So sometimes I think people have a gut reaction of no technology, this will take our jobs. And I think one of the challenges with climate is there is so much work to be done that we need to figure out how to do all of the work at once with all of the people being empowered to both survive a scenario in which, you know, people of color, people who are living in poverty are going to have a harder time surviving climate change. That is a reality. They don't have the money to evacuate if a big storm is coming. If, you know, there's a power outage for 3 days and they lose everything in their fridge, food insecurity. You're thinking about, you know, crop loss. All of these different things are all different ways that communities are impacted. And so I think one of the things we really need to be thinking about is sometimes I think there's a desire in any type of morally justified space or community oriented space to have a very sharp, this is always the answer. And I think with climate, one of the things we just need to be aware of is it's going to be all of the above, because I don't necessarily want a farm worker to go work when the air is toxic outside. And I also don't want that food to go bad. And so somebody might say, oh, you're automating away jobs. And it's like, no. I want that job to exist. I want it to be less dangerous. I want it to be less painful. I want that worker to be able to take sick leave without the crop going bad. And so I think we need to really think about how do we find that balance that really works for the people in the community to get the results of what a cleaner, sustainable future could look like.
So
I want to say something real quick, and that is nothing is better for adaptation and resilience than wealth building. You tell that to some of these investors and they're like, Well, what about the climate tech? What about the, they want to give money to Elon Musk's machine that's going to be rolled out and pollution is sucked away and it's solved, but that is not going to be what we need. And further, I would say, and this, I was raised in climate tech on the TCFD and on climate risk and in finance. These investors, these real estate investors, the people that have the data, they know they're not going to be able to pour money, billions of dollars into these huge infrastructure projects where communities around them are crumbling. Some of the best resilience officers that I know were raised in the military, and they know, because the military's been working on this, like, if we are not all safe, we can't expect our hydrogen hubs to work. If people are starving, like, how's that going to work? We are related. This is all interrelated. So funding communities is much more than a nice to do. Funding small business is much more than a nice to do. It's actually an imperative.
Okay, Lynn, come on and
Yeah,
jump in.
I want to say, first of all, thank you to our amazing panel. We've had so many kudos, comments, reactions in the chat, just showing how much the things you are saying are resonating with people. And thank you, Eric, for your fabulous job moderating this conversation. I know I have been just really learning a lot. We only have a minute really left. I'm going to just pick one of the questions we received from our audience that I thought could be relevant to a few folks. This person was talking about how they're working with their city government. They have an idea for a project. The city's interested in moving forward, but they have this sort of requirement to competitively bid it out. And I can see how that could be a challenge for a lot of small businesses. So any advice on how to navigate that type of situation where you want to work with someone, federal, state, local government, and they have this competitive bidding process? How do you get around that as a small business, or how do you work with that process?
Well,
So I'd
one
say-
thing that, one thing that we do, because we are in multiple cities across the country, and it goes back to community-based organizations. You have to understand that the community are the constituents for these elected officials. So if you really want to get a project off the ground, one, you do need the government, but you also need the community by you as well, or else you're not going anywhere. Because you can go ahead and go directly to government, but government is going to send you back to the communities, especially if you're going after any of this federal funding. Like we said, it's community-based. So work with your communities, get them on board with your project, then together take that into the government. If you need to find community-based organizations, check in at dream.org. We work directly with communities and entrepreneurs who are trying to get shovel-ready projects off the ground and be able to access the dollars that are out there from the federal government.
I'd say one more thing, which is the reason for a competitive request for proposals is designed to protect the community from the kind of corruption where somebody's friends with the governor and elected, and they get to unilaterally make that decision. And so if you're working with the community and it's actually a good project, you might still have to do an RFP, but they might write it based on the community has asked for XYZ. You are the best organization for XYZ, ergo you're going to win the RFP. And so kind of being aware that that's part of the process for many jurisdictions, especially if they have, strong anti-corruption measures in place. The other thing is to check the local requirements, because sometimes all that they need is for you to have won an RFP for the same scopes and type of work. And so, in California, one of the things that's commonly used if people are buying vehicles at a school district level is what's called a piggyback bid. So for example, one school district does an RFP, all of the manufacturers apply, here's the price of our school buses and the services that go with it. Then any other school district can piggyback off that RFP because it was a competitive open bid process. And so there's kind of two different pathways. One is figure out, do they need an RFP, or have you done something similar before that they could use as the basis for a new contract? Or if you do need an RFP, how do you work with the community so that the community defines the exact parameters to enable the solutions that the community needs and wants that you are able to serve?
Okay, fantastic. And then I guess there's one quick question, follow-up of that is, can an RFP through can a land lease help with this situation?
I think it would really depend on the project. It's one of those things where you're like,
Right.
is
I need the
there?
details. Yeah.
It's one of those, maybe not.
Right. Well, I'm sorry, we had so many fantastic other questions that we've kind of run out of time, but I'll just say some of these questions, we've gotten questions about programs for more innovative technologies as opposed to standard. I would encourage those folks to really look at our funding database. We've also gotten some questions on where small businesses can find support with paperwork. I would say to look at our clean tech ecosystem resources list, look at some of the organizations that are listed there, a lot of state and local folks. And then we've got a couple of questions relating to sort of payback periods in LMI communities and how that could be longer. But I think a lot of these financing structures you are talking about, our panel's talking about, are trying to overcome some of those challenges. But I apologize we haven't gotten through all of the questions, but just a fantastic discussion. I've put the contact information and website links for our various panelists up here, and we will be distributing the slides and recordings so you can explore all of these links at your leisure. Thank you again to our incredible panel. Thank you to Eric for moderating, and thank you to our audience for joining us today.
Thank you, everybody. We're really glad to have had you here with us.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.